Hope that you're doing well on this Wednesday evening. We're picking up our study in the book of First Kings. Last week we spent some time introducing the study, looking at some of the outlines of the book and how it is put together and what it's trying to accomplish. And so tonight we begin our study of the text. And so let's jump right in because we've got 53 verses to traverse throughout this particular session. So what's going to take place, as you remember, is First Kings chapters 1 through 11. When you looked at First Kings, it's divided into two 11-chapter sections where you have the reign of Solomon in First Kings 1 through 11, and then you've got the beginnings of the divided kingdom in 12 through 22. And so we're beginning that first section, those first 11 chapters that discuss the reign of Solomon, which was a 40-year period. You remember that Saul, David, and Solomon each reigned 40 years apiece. And so, as we begin this chapter explains how Solomon came to the throne, that it was surrounded by some controversy, not created by him, but created by his brother Adonijah. And so, as we move through this text, let's keep this in mind. First, in the first four verses, we're introduced to the situation at hand that is causing some controversy, and that is that David's energy and his vitality is escaping and leaving him. And so that leaves and that opens the door for the question of who will be king next. So beginning in chapter 1, verse 1. Now, King David was old and advanced in years. Now, we know this from other texts that King David was roughly 70 years old at this time. 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 4, he was about 30 when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem. So he's roughly 70. Now, that's not necessarily an old age as we might consider it in American culture, but you have to remember, in a culture where the average lifespan of an adult was only to about 40, if you lived beyond 40 years, you were doing pretty good at this time. And so he's prospered and been able to live on until he's the age 70. And so here he is older, and it says, although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. He could not keep warm. And it may be that this was during one of those cold, damp winters in Jerusalem where pneumonia was a very real issue, and maybe he's struggling with some of that. He just can't seem to get warm with everything that's going on. Therefore, verse 2, his servants said to him, let a young woman be sought for my lord the king, and let her wait on the king and be in his service. Let her lie in your arms, that my lord the king may be warm. Now, there's a number of questions that exist around this. What does it mean for her to lie in his arms? Now, what we know very clearly from the end of verse 4, which we'll get to in just a minute, is that the king knew her not. That is, he was not sexually active with this young woman. But when you look at the phrase, let her lie in your arms, and you study it the way it's used in other texts, like Genesis 16 and verse 5, or Micah chapter 7 and verse 5, it could have a sexual connotation to it, okay? Because certain times, in this culture, when you had kings who could no longer perform sexually, that they were considered past their prime, and thus it was time to put in a younger man who had the vitality of life still in him. And so it may be that that's kind of what's going on, although it could just have the idea of a close affection or companionship. For an example, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, when Nathan tells David the parable of the ewe lamb, 2 Samuel 12 and verse 3, that describing the ewe lamb was, and it would lie in his arms. Now, certainly there's no sexual connotation there, but there is a close kinship that existed. And so there are two different schools of thought here about what is going on. Is she just there to serve him, or did they bring her into the house to be a concubine, a kind of a second tier wife, so to speak, and were the advisors trying to see if a beautiful young woman could reassert his vitality, or whether it was time for him to pass and she could simply take care of him. Those are the two schools of thought behind what's going on here. In verse 3, it says, so they sought for a beautiful young woman throughout all the territory of Israel, and found Abishag the Shunammite, and brought her to the king. Now, Shunem, which we'll run into later in the Kings, but it's at the foot or southeast of Mount Carmel. If you're looking at a map of Palestine or Israel, you'll notice that when the Mediterranean Sea is on your left, about 3/4 of the way up the Mediterranean Sea, there's looks like a little thumb that sticks out into the Mediterranean Sea, and that is Mount Carmel. And so Shunem would have been somewhere around that particular region. We'll run in again. We'll run into Shunem, or the Shunammite, again in 2 Kings chapter 4. Not this Shunammite, but a different Shunammite. So they find her and they bring her to the king. The young woman was very beautiful, and she was of service to the king and attended to him, but the king knew her not. Okay. So again, he is failing in his physical health. Either scenario you take of the understanding of what Abishag's role was, what we know is that his health is failing. Now, his mental faculties are still very much present, and we're going to see that come to the forefront. He is not senile. He has not lost a step when it comes to his mental faculties, but it seems that his body is beginning to fail him. And so, realizing that his health is failing and that his death is imminent, one of his sons seizes an opportunity. So instead of being a son and being there for his father and loving his father in the final days of his life, he's like, unfortunately, some individuals today, that they can't wait for their parents to die so they can circle in on an inheritance. They're like vultures moving in toward an animal that is almost dead. And so now, verse 5, and notice the use of the word now, introducing, we're shifting gears. Adonijah, whose name means Yahweh is my Lord, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. Literally, I and no other person will be king. And so he's assuming this position, which, by the way, he has no right to assume. His father has not promised it to him. As we're going to see in a moment, his father has promised it to Solomon already, so it's not his, but he's seizing the opportunity to usurp the throne. And it says he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. And so an entourage, kind of like a presidential motorcade, if you can think of it that way, a Middle Eastern, centuries old motorcade where you would have a nice chariot and you would have bodyguards with you traveling the same way our president travels in his particular limousine that is nicknamed the Beast. And then you have other vehicles around it surrounded with personal bodyguards in those particular vehicles. And so that's what he's doing here. Now, you remember, and what we're going to see is, I think there is an intentional play by the writer of Kings to draw back to take our minds from the way he presents Adonijah, to take our minds back to the way the writer of Samuel introduced us to Absalom and his rebellion, because in 2 Samuel 15, that's one of the first things that he does. He gets his group of people together, he gets his entourage together, and so he begins acting like a king before he is actually a king. Then in verse 6, it says, his father had never at any time displeased him by asking, why have you done thus and so? Now, he also has that in common with his brother Absalom. When he kills Amnon for raping his sister Tamar, or when Amnon rapes Tamar, he says nothing to either of them. He doesn't really confront either one of them. In 2 Samuel chapter 18, after he has sent his father off of the throne and fleeing for his life, his request is for everyone to be gentle with Absalom, which you can understand from a father's perspective. But at the same time, David has a track record of not disciplining his children. And of all of David's great qualities, one of his failures was as a father. He did not raise his children and hold them accountable and hold them to a disciplinary standard that allowed them to develop into solid individuals in the kingdom. And so we see that repeated here. Now, again, another thing that brings us back to Absalom, Adonijah is also a very handsome man. And he was born next after Absalom. Okay. And so Adonijah, when you follow the chronology, Amnon was the oldest, and he was killed by Absalom in 2 Samuel 13 for raping Tamar. Okay. Then Absalom dies, of course, in his rebellion in 2 Samuel 18. Now, there is a child mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 3, but it is believed that he is also dead. And so that would put the first three sons of David being dead, and that would put then Adonijah as the oldest living son of David, which in most cultures would mean he's the one that is going to be the heir to the throne. But what we know about God through Old Testament biblical history is that many times he will take the younger children and make them the ones who receive promises or rise to positions of prominence. I mean, David himself, the king here, was the youngest I understand they weren't a monarch, they weren't a family of monarchs, but he was the youngest of his brothers and he came to the throne. And then you see Isaac is the younger and he receives the blessing, not Ishmael. You see that Jacob is the younger and he receives the blessing, not Esau. And so this is a pretty consistent pattern with how God takes care of some of these things. Even Moses, he was one of the younger. Miriam and Aaron were both older than him, and he's the one who steps into that leadership position. And so here he is, and Adonijah probably believes he has a right to the throne, thus being the oldest. And so it says, verse 7, he conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and Abiathar, the priest, and they followed Adonijah and helped him. Now, Joab was his father's chief general, also related to David. So when you look at Joab, what we know about Joab, though, is that Joab had a personal agenda. Joab did a lot of things that David was not happy with. And he is very politically motivated. He's willing to push his own agenda, even to endanger other people by pushing his own agenda. And so he's not the kind of guy you want on your team. So the fact that Adonijah is associating with him kind of causes our ears to perk up a little bit. But then also Abiathar, the priest, you remember this, he and David cross paths in 1 Samuel 22 when Saul has Doeg murder all the priests at Nob for harboring David. Abiathar is one of those priests, and he becomes the one in charge of the Urim and Thummim and things like that in 2 Samuel 23. So they follow Adonijah and help him. But, verse 8, and it's interesting that the writer says, here are the people who were not with him, but Zadok the priest, another of these chief priests, 1 Chronicles 16 and verse 39. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, who was one of David's mighty men from 2 Samuel 23, was in charge of the personal bodyguards of King David himself, which we will see them here in just a little bit in our text. Nor is Benaiah involved, nor Nathan the prophet, the close companion and counselor from the Lord, and Shimei. Now, some people believe that this is the same Shimei, 1 Kings 2 and 2 Samuel 16, that cursed David as he was fleeing from Absalom in his rebellion. Whether or not that's true, it's hard to tell. Then you've got Ray, which we don't know anything about this individual other than his name mentioned here. And then you've got David's mighty men mentioned in 2 Samuel 23, 8 through 9, a very group of talented elite soldiers. They were not with Adonijah. They were not with Adonijah. And so you've got a couple of leaders going with Adonijah, but the core of David's inner circle, the most faithful of David's inner circle, they're not with Adonijah. And Adonijah knows not to even try to win them over. And so that tells you something about with whom he's associating and what he's doing and the assumptions. And so basically if I had to sum it like this, he's a spoiled brat who's always gotten his way, and he believes he's going to get his way now. And so he's doing some underhanded things to try and get his way. So this is what takes place in verse number 9. Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen and fatted cattle by the serpent's stone. Some people believe that this was a serpent stone or sliding rocks. So it could have been a place where rocks had slidden down and created some natural kind of a structure or an indentation into the terrain that would have drawn people naturally there. Either way, it's in Rogel, which is about a half a mile from the palace in Jerusalem. And he invites all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials of Judah. But, and again, the text points out who is not there. He did not invite Nathan the prophet or Benaiah or the mighty men or Solomon his brother. Now, it seems like all the other brothers that are living and all the other members of the royal family, basically, outside of Solomon, are there, other than maybe Bathsheba, of course, who is Solomon's mother. And so there is a sense of sneakiness and underhandedness about this. Obviously, I don't think it's hard to see that when you read this text. He's a very underhanded kind of guy. People who have to do those types of things in secret, they're up to no good. And he's excluding them, which would also say that if he gets power, he's probably going to remove them. I mean, he's already an underhanded character. It's not hard to believe that if he ever does get control, then Nathan and Solomon and Benaiah and some of these mighty men, they're dead. He's going to have them executed. So here's the plot beginning to develop. Then Nathan and Bathsheba work and start moving David toward naming his successor in order to try and clear this situation up. So, verse 11. Then Nathan said to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. You remember Solomon was born, 2 Samuel chapter 12. Well, 2 Samuel 11, you have David and Bathsheba committing adultery, and a child is conceived. And then that child dies as a part of the judgment of God, 2 Samuel chapter 12. But then David goes into Bathsheba and comforts her, and she has a child, and they name him Solomon. And then God sends Nathan to give him the name Jedediah, one who is loved by the Lord. And so Solomon's mother is Bathsheba. So Nathan said to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and David our Lord does not know it? Have you heard what's going on, basically? Now, therefore, come, let me give you advice that we may save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. He understands the implications. He says this, so go in at once to King David and say to him, did not my lord the king swear to your servant, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne? Why then is Adonijah king? Then while you are still speaking with the king, I also will come in after you and confirm your words. Now, a lot of people accuse Nathan and Bathsheba of some underhanded craftsmanship here. I do not think that's what's going on at all. Okay? I understand where these individuals who hold this are coming from. I respect it. I just don't agree with it at all. Because God has promised that Solomon is going to be the king. Now, he's not, you won't find that promise in 2 Samuel. You'll find it in Chronicles, but you won't find it in 2 Samuel. So Solomon has been promised the throne. And so what Nathan is doing, who has always acted with integrity and always been the voice and the mouth of God to David, is now moving things. It seems as if he's moving these pieces to get things going in the right direction. So he tells Bathsheba, you go in and talk to David, and then I'll come in behind you and reaffirm that, and we'll try and work this thing out. Verse 15. So Bathsheba went to the king in his chamber. Now the king was very old, and Abishag the Shunammite was attending to the king. Bathsheba bowed and paid homage to the king, and the king said, what do you desire? She answered to him, my lord, you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne. Now again, if you look at 1 Chronicles 22, verses 9 and 10, and 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 5, you will see references to that fact that God had indeed promised it. God and David had indeed decided that Solomon would be the one to sit on the throne. So she uses that as a preface to then this, verse 18. And now behold, Adonijah is king, although you, my lord, the king, do not know it. He's working around under your nose. You've said it should be one way, and this is how it's transpiring. He has sacrificed oxen and fatted cattle and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the sons of the king, Abiathar the priest, Joab the commander of the army, that Solomon your servant has not been invited. And now, my lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you to tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise, it will come to pass when my lord the king sleeps with his fathers, that is, that he is dead, that I and my son Solomon will be counted as offenders. And so she's urging him toward action. You promised me and Solomon that he would be the king. Now Adonijah is acting as king, and all of Israel is waiting on you to make a decision. They need to know whether you approve of what Adonijah is doing in an underhanded way, or if it's going to be Solomon. Now, Adonijah is still somewhat under wraps, but Bathsheba is forcing his hand to say, people want to know who's going to succeed you. They know your health is failing. So make the decision. Verse 22, while she was still speaking with the king, Nathan the prophet came in and told the king, here is Nathan the prophet. And when he came in before the king, he bowed before the king with his face to the ground. And Nathan said, my lord the king, have you said Adonijah shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne? Now he's priming him with a series of questions. Of course, he knows the answers. For he has gone down this day and has sacrificed oxen, fatted cattle, and sheep in abundance. And he has invited all the king's sons and the commanders of the army and Abiathar the priest. And behold, they are eating and drinking before him and saying, long live King Adonijah. But me, your servant, and Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon, he has not invited. Has this thing been brought about by my lord the king, and you have not told your servants who would sit on the throne of the Lord? of my lord the king after him. And so so Bathsheba comes in, and her argument is basically this: you told me that Solomon would sit on the throne. This is happening by Adonijah. Israel is waiting for a decision. You need to do something. Otherwise, we're going to die, because when he becomes king, he's going to kill us. Nathan comes in and says, why have you cut me out of the loop on this? Have you made a decision and not informed me of the decision? Now, David is going to move to action in verse 30. Then David answered, call Bathsheba to me. So she came into the king's presence and stood before the king. And the king swore, saying, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my soul out of every adversity. Now, I want to pause there for a second, because I love that statement. The Lord who has redeemed my soul out of all of this adversity. It reminds me of Psalm 23, which those of you that are watching that are members at Moulton know that that's probably one of my favorite psalms, if not my favorite psalm in all of Scripture. There's so much to it, and not the generic understanding, the pie in the sky idea that so many people want to take out of Psalm 23, but a legitimate, down to earth, heart transforming understanding of what Psalm 23 is really about, and the relationship that exists in that psalm. I think of that when I hear David say, the one who has redeemed my soul out of all adversity, the one who has prepared a table before me in the presence of my enemies, the one who has walked with me in the valley of the shadow of death. You see, his relationship with God is shining through, even in his old age, even as he is dying, and he's basically on his deathbed. He refers to God, and he looks back on his life and says, he's the one who has redeemed me out of all adversity. He's the one who gave me all of this. And so that's a very solemn way to introduce then what he's going to say. As I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, Solomon, your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. Even so I will do this day. Then Bathsheba bowed her face to the ground and paid homage to the king and said, may my Lord King David live forever. And so obviously David is just saying, I'm going to do what I promised. Verse 32, King David said, call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. And so he gets those individuals, that inner circle that's still extremely faithful to him, the ones that he trusts, and he says, okay, this is what's going to happen. Take with you the servants of your Lord, and have Solomon my son ride on my own mule, and bring him down to Gihon, and let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet there anoint him king over Israel, then blow the trumpet and say, long live King Solomon. And so I want you to, he says, first of all, set him on my own mule. Now you remember, this is pretty significant, because this is the equivalent to, whereas Adonijah has built and fabricated his own motorcade, so to speak, this is the king's mule. Not just anybody rides on this thing. When you ride on this mule, it carries with it a message. You remember in Esther chapter 6, when the king desired to honor what Mordecai had done for him? He sat him on his own mule and paraded him through the city and went out before him. And of course, it's somewhat comical because it turns the pages on Haman, and Haman has to lead that procession. But anyway, the point is that he has him riding on that own mule. And so it's David's way of kind of sending a visual signal. He's the next guy in line. Bring him down to Gihon, a spring located probably on a busy street somewhere in the city square, according to some sources. And so it would have been a very public thing, as opposed to Adonijah's private meeting off in the corner somewhere. This is extremely public. There's nothing to hide. And then anoint him king over Israel. These are still his instructions. Then blow the trumpet and say, long live King Solomon. Verse 35, you shall then come up after him, and he shall come and sit on my throne. Again, another visual reminder. So he's making his public statement. All the eyes of Israel are upon him, and he's going to give them an answer. He's going to give them something to see and something to hear. And so put him on my throne, for he shall be king in my place. And I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and Judah. And Benaiah the son of Jehoiada answered the king, Amen. May the Lord, the God of my Lord the king, say so. As the Lord has been with my Lord the king, even so may he be with Solomon, and may his throne be greater than the throne of my Lord King David. And so Benaiah obviously accepts that. He offers praise for David's decision and offers a blessing for Solomon that the household of David would continue, which, you remember, this is a key moment because we've only had two kings in Israel up to this point, Saul and David. Saul and his family, they were removed. You had a dynasty change. David takes over. And then God promises David in 2 Samuel 7 that his house is always going to be ruling. Well, this is how the first step in that transition is when it goes from David to Solomon. This is the first family transition that we have of kings in the nation of Israel. So, verse 38, so Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada and the Kerethites and the Pelethites went down and had Solomon ride on the king's mule and brought him into Gihon. So you've got these two groups of people mentioned here, the Kerethites and the Pelethites, most likely from Crete and Philistia. And it was not uncommon for kings' personal bodyguards to be from other nations because they wouldn't necessarily have the beefs with the king that could lead to assassination attempts. So let's say you enact a policy as a king. You set out a new decree or a rule, and that decree directly affects a group of Israelites. Well, in that group of Israelites directly affected, one of the individuals directly affected is related to one of your bodyguards. Well, your bodyguard has skin in the game and has a reason then to avenge something that's been done to the person, his family, and so he assassinates the king. But if you go outside of the kingdom, bring in other people who don't really have any skin in the game other than the fact the king pays them and takes care of them, there's a little bit more safety in that, was the general idea behind that. And so you have these individuals here from the most likely, we said, the island of Crete and Philistia. And of course, the Philistines came from another island and immigrated, you might say, or moved into that coastal region of the Mediterranean Sea. So they bring him in a royal escort. Then there Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. Then they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, "Long live King Solomon." So they anoint him with the horn of oil, the same way that happened with David, 1 Samuel 16:1, 1 Samuel 16 and verse 13. And all of the people are rejoicing in this. Verse 40, and all the people went up after him, playing on pipes and rejoicing with great joy, so that the earth was split by their noise. You see the metaphor that is used. The earth was split by their noise. It was just loud. Everybody was so happy, and it was an extremely good day. So, verse 41. Adonijah and all the guests who were with him heard it as they had finished eating. When Joab heard the sound of the trumpet, he said, "What does the uproar in the city mean?" This was not just a normal uproar, okay? There was something special about this noise, and they can start putting it together. Again, they're about a half mile from the palace. They can hear this. They know what's going on. While he was still speaking, behold, Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, the priest, came. And Adonijah said, "Come in, for you are a worthy man, and bring good news." Unfortunately, that's not the way it worked out for Adonijah. Jonathan answered Adonijah, "No, for our Lord King David has made Solomon king." Adonijah is being optimistic. "We know that you brought us good news." And Jonathan quickly bursts his bubble and says, "No. David has actually made Solomon king. That's not good news for you. And the king has sent Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada and the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and they have made him ride on the king's mule. And Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet have anointed him king at Gihon, and they have gone up from there rejoicing, so that the city is in an uproar. And this is the noise that you have heard. Solomon sits on the royal throne. Moreover, the king's servants came to congratulate our Lord King David, saying, May your God make the name of Solomon more famous than yours, and make his throne greater than your throne. And the king bowed himself on his bed. So it's already happened. And you can almost see Adonijah, like every bit of wind is going out of his sail. Like maybe the whole world is stopping. He thought he had it together. He thought he was out ahead of the game. And then all of a sudden it just did a 180 on him. And now it's completely different. So Solomon has been anointed. Everybody's rejoicing. He's on the throne. Servants are coming to David and blessing him and commending him for his choice. And so things aren't going well for Adonijah. Verse 48, and the king also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who has granted me someone to sit on my throne this day, my own eyes seeing it. Again, to be able to see the succession of his family line. Obviously would be a proud moment for him for many reasons, but would confirm to him the promises that God had made. He would live to see the fulfillment of that promise, at least in a small way. You remember that promise in 2 Samuel 7, as we've talked about several times, has not just one fulfillment, but actually double fulfillment. It has a fuller fulfillment in Jesus, used quoted in Acts 2 and Hebrews 1. So, verse 49, now Adonijah is all alone. Then all the guests of Adonijah trembled and rose, and each went his way. I want you to see this. When you've got somebody who's underhanded in their dealings like Adonijah, and they surround themselves with people that are equally underhanded in their dealings, when things go bad, they turn on each other quickly. They are not legitimately committed to each other. They are all self-seeking individuals. Because the second that things are going bad for Adonijah, everybody runs. Because everybody's only out for himself. They were only with Adonijah to begin with because they wanted to be on his good side. They were still looking out for themselves. And the second Adonijah, bad news comes to Adonijah, they abandon him. And so people who use people end up finding each other. And sometimes their plans work and sometimes their plans don't. And thanks be to God, on this occasion, their plans did not work. So here they are. Verse 50, and Adonijah feared Solomon. So he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. The horns of the altar, there's a couple different things going on here. The horns of the altar could be the horns of the altar where they would offer the sacrifices. Exodus 28 and Exodus 30 describe that. I think Exodus 28:2, Exodus 30, verse 2. Some recent archaeological discoveries have actually seen 6-foot square. They've unearthed 6-foot square altars with horns in Dan and Beersheba, which would have been the northernmost extremity of Israel, Dan, and Beersheba, the southernmost extremity. But it's probably not to that that's referring. It's probably the horns of the altar where the tabernacle was at this particular occasion. And so people would flee there as a sense of asylum. It was pretty common in these cultures, especially, where criminals could seek asylum in houses of worship or in those places. And so some people believe obviously that's what Adonijah is doing here. And so when you're cleaving to the horns of that altar where sacrifices were made, you were saying a couple of things. Number one, you were saying, you can't pass judgment on me, only God can do that, or I'm clinging to the forgiveness of God, and so you should forgive me the way that God forgives me. But it's a ploy to try and save your life. Now, again, notice something about this. You see, Adonijah's intention from the beginning was to seize the throne and kill Solomon. Now, he cannot bring himself to conceive of the fact that if Solomon somehow got the throne, that he would do the same thing to him. Now, ultimately, Adonijah is going to die. We're going to see that in the next chapter because he tries some underhanded stuff again, and Solomon's already warned him. But the reason why Adonijah acts this way is because he believes Solomon is going to act the same way that he would have acted if he were in Solomon's shoes. Because he was already planning to be in Solomon's shoes, and his plan in Solomon's as being king was to kill Solomon. And so he assumes Solomon is going to kill him. You see, that's the way wicked and evil people work. They cannot conceive of someone doing something for a motive that is different than their own. They can't perceive it. They can't understand it. Verse 51, then it was told Solomon, behold, Adonijah fears King Solomon, for behold, he has laid hold of the horns on the altar, saying, let King Solomon swear to me first that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. And Solomon said, if he will show himself a worthy man, no, not one of the hairs of his head shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So Solomon sent, and they brought him down from the altar, and he came and paid homage to King Solomon. And Solomon said to him, go to your house. Some people believe that's the final statement. Go to your house is Solomon's way of dismissing him from public service. Go and don't let me see you again. I don't want to see you, and I don't want to hear of you pulling any more of these underhanded tricks. Go down to your house, live in peace, and be a worthy man. If you're not, then you will die. And of course, by worthy man, he means don't try this again. Don't try and overthrow. Don't try and pull underhanded stunts. Be who you're supposed to be. And so in this opening chapter, what we've seen is the decline of David and the wicked intentions of Adonijah and how God thwarts the wicked intentions of Adonijah. And that's how Solomon comes to the throne. But there's something that I want us to see continuously as we walk through the kings. What we're going to see is that we're not going to have many good kings at all. But even the kings that are good, they still have huge, huge issues. And so what we're seeing is the imperfection of human beings, the imperfections of human rulers. And it's telling us that we still need something better. Yes, we've got kings, but they're not righteous. They're not wholly righteous to God. We need something better. And so there's this anticipation of someone that's better, a king that is better than them. And that's what we have in Jesus. Jesus is going to be this king who is better than them. And it's not going to be a physical, earthly kingdom. It's going to be a spiritual kingdom where he's going to reign and he's going to be perfect and justice will prevail. And God's glory will always be manifested and displayed. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing things. We're understanding how history is unfolding that gets us to Jesus, but we're also seeing why we need Jesus. And we all need to understand that we need Jesus to be in control of our lives as our King. And I hope that he is in control of our lives. And if he's not, we can submit ourselves to him. If we have a penitent faith that confesses Jesus in order to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins, we become part of his family. We become part of his kingdom. We're translated from the power of darkness into the kingdom of his dear son, or the son of his love, Colossians 1 and verse 13. And as New Testament Christians, under the reign of Jesus, we don't need to be pulling stunts like Adonijah. An equivalent in the New Testament church to Adonijah was Diotrephes. He's trying to supplant God in his glory. We don't need any of that. And so if we have been like Adonijah, we need to seek the forgiveness of our King. Hope you'll continue to be with us as we watch this wonderful story unfold.